Specialists in reading claim that whenever some person writes, that author selects a segment of human behavior and presents it in a language known by the author and the reader. The reader brings her or his full knowledge of culture and society to this written segment, a piece of language, and allows the author to manipulate the reader's knowledge so that it will match the author's vision. What do you think that Matthew's Jesus intended to say to his first century Palestinian audience when he suggested that his followers are, or should be, like salt, or like a lit lamp? What do you think Jesus' audience understood when they heard the exhortation in these verses? What kind of ideas would they have had? The Greek word for earth in the New Testament most likely translates a Hebrew or Aramaic word that has two meanings: earth and clay oven. Jesus' exhortation to his disciples that they should be salt makes best Mediterranean literal cultural sense when the phrase is earth oven or clay oven rather than earth. So Matthew's Jesus urges, you, meaning my followers in general, should be salt for the earth oven. In first century Palestine, ovens were made from earth or clay. They are similar to the familiar horno, which you can still see on reservations in New Mexico. The fuel burned in this earth oven was camel or donkey dung. As a part of growing up, young girls were trained to collect and roll this animal dung into patties. Then it would be salted and left to dry in the sun. This dried animal dung was subsequently burned as needed in the earth oven. The floor of the earth oven was lined with a flat plate or block of rock salt, which many peasants who used such ovens believed served as a catalyst for burning the fuel. In reality, the rock salt with the clay proved to be an excellent heat store, but ancient Israelites thought that salt had the capacity to make things burn. Look at Psalm 12 verse 6 in the New Revised Standard Version. The promises of the Lord are promises that are pure, silver refined in a furnace on the ground, purified 7 times. What are the words of the Lord compared to? To refined silver. Where is this silver refined? The Hebrew literally reads, in a furnace made of earth. Look at how the New Revised Standard Version translates the phrase, in a furnace on the ground. And look over at the New American Bible, Revised Edition, which renders it this way: the promises of the Lord are sure, silver refined in a crucible, silver purified 7 times. What happened to the earth oven there? It is missing, along with the understanding of what the author is actually saying and his culturally specific connection between earth and oven. You see how much gets lost in translation? Now look at the New Revised Standard Version, Job chapter 28, verse 5. As for the earth, out of it comes bread, but underneath it is turned up as by fire. Where does bread come from? Does bread really come from the earth, like Mother Earth or planet Earth? Well, I guess, eventually, after passing through many hands. But that isn't what the author of Job means, is it? What he's talking about is not the earth, but the clay oven. Isn't that where bread comes from in this cultural world? And look again, what is turned up or ravaged by fire? The earth or the earth oven? The author is talking about the oven shared by ancient villages. And this is the scenario the anonymous author known as Matthew and the other evangelists can reliably expect their Mediterranean readers to bring to the gospel texts, so that each respective author can manipulate the scenario in the reader's mind so as to communicate to that considerate reader. In the world of ancient Mediterraneans, salt placed on the oven floor and salt sprinkled on the dung was believed to serve as a catalyst helping the fuel to burn. After a few years of this, the heat of the fire caused the salt crystals of the oven to undergo a chemical reaction, and as a result, the salt, formerly helping make an excellent storage of heat, now impedes and stifles the burning of the dung. It's when these crystals are thus transformed chemically that the salt loses its saltiness, that is, its ability to help create a heat store, and for our ancients, its catalytic ability. Salt, of course, never really loses salty taste, but who would want to taste salt on which animal dung has been laid? Please bring this Mediterranean cultural scenario along with you as you read the New Testament salt passages, like Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. Should the follower of Jesus be a seasoning that flavors food, makes it tasty? Should a follower of Jesus be a preservative to the world, to the culture? That's what Robert Barron says. That's what James Martin says. And that's what NT Wright says. Or could it be that these Western popular Christian writers and speakers are just wrong, and that they have the wrong cultural scenario in their heads whenever they read Matthew and Matthew chapter 5? Maybe Matthew chapter 5 and other such salty passages in the New Testament are not really talking about flavor seasoning or preserving anything. Maybe what the Matthean Jesus means is that his followers are to be catalysts, fire starters. Again, does salt ever lose its saltiness? Not really. But do catalysts ever lose their catalytic ability, their ability to start fires? Yeah, they do. And ancient Galileans, what would they do with a salt plate or block that you remove from the oven with this burned up dung? Would you use it for flavoring? Would they use it for preserving food? That doesn't make sense. How about instead they would use it as a solid footing for a muddy path? Using these verses as the conclusion to his version of the Beatitudes, what point does anonymous author we call Matthew really want Jesus to make? Are the followers of Jesus, his disciples, to be the flavor of the world? The seasoning of the world? Are they to preserve the world? I bet that would suit bishops like Robert Barron very well. For him, we should preserve the status quo. Keep the hierarchy and the power right where it is, huh? Oh, you can have your synod, but I adjudicate, says Robert Barron. Is that what Jesus was saying? Keeping the power structures in power? You know, I'm talking about the real Jesus, whom the Synoptic Gospels tell us was put to death for burning up the authorities by humiliating them in their temple. Now let's read carefully Mark chapter 9, verses 49 through 50. For everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its saltiness, how can you season it? Have salt in yourselves, and be at peace with one another. What is the Markan Jesus talking about here? Well, he's just a moment ago talked about scandal in verse 42. That is about causing those who believe in him to sin, meaning to dishonor or shame the God of Israel. Then the Markan Jesus urges that a person should get rid of the instrument of scandal at all costs, in order to avoid being thrown into Gehenna, the Jerusalem garbage dump, where the fire never dies out. Here the word fire quite naturally brings to mind the catalyst, salt. Hence the logical sequence from verse 48 to verse 49 and verse 50. See? What does it mean to be salted for the fire? Is it similar to the dung which is thus prepared to be fuel in the earth oven? Does salted for the fire have anything to do with being a catalyst? Salt is indeed good, but if it loses catalytic agency, then what? Why would Jesus urge his listeners to be salty, but at the same time to stay at peace with one another? Could it be that a salty person, a catalyst, stirs up trouble? Starts fights? Now let's look over at Luke chapter 14, verses 34 to 35. Luke and Jesus says, salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is useful neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. They throw it away. If you have ears to hear, then hear. Okay, so in the preceding context of these Lucan verses, the Lucan Jesus urges those who would be his disciples to take stock before beginning a project. Otherwise, you're going to be shamed, embarrassed, humiliated, dishonored by being unable to complete the task. So Lucan Jesus uses the example of planning for a war, and his concluding words highlight his concern: discipleship. Verse 33, so therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions. What impact does this last verse, Luke chapter 14, verse 33, have on the salt passage that follows? What does salt, or fire-starting catalyst, have to do with discipleship? Please notice the literal truth of the statement. Salt that has lost catalytic ability is good neither for the earth oven nor for preparing fuel. It's good neither for the land, the earth oven, nor the dunghill, potential fuel. So what do you do with such salt? What would happen to a disciple who lost his or her catalytic ability? Now let's look at Luke chapter 12, verses 49 through 53. Luke and Jesus says, I have come to cast fire upon the earth oven, and how I wish it were already ablaze. I have a dipping with which to be dipped, and what constraint I am under until it is completed. Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the land? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, 5 in one household will be divided. 3 against 2, 2 against 3. They will be divided. Father against son, and son against father. Mother against daughter, and daughter against mother. Mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. Wow. Does that sound like Jesus wants to season things into something tasty and good to eat? Or that he wishes to preserve the status quo? No. Reading that passage sounds like someone wants to burn things up to a crisp. The preceding context of these verses urges that one be prepared rather than unprepared for all eventualities. Would it be fair to say that Jesus saw his purpose as lighting the oven or starting fires? Instead of peace, Jesus brings division. How is this salty characteristic played out in families as they wrestle with their estimate of Jesus? Father against son, and son against father. Mother against daughter, and daughter against mother. Mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Okay, let's take all of this better understanding and return and read Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. You all, in the Matthean Jesus group, are the fire starters of the peasant village earth oven. But if the fire starter loses its catalytic agency, with what can it be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but to be thrown out like the ashen animal it is mixed with, to be trampled underfoot. And then Jesus starts talking about a lamp, which is lit on fire and gives light to the whole house. The image of salt as a catalyst for the fire in an earth oven leads very naturally to this next image, a lamp, lit and held high for everybody to see. My friends, only this literal, Mediterranean, authentically cultural understanding of salt and earth oven makes such a smooth combination of images in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 to 14. The anonymous author we call Matthew and the other evangelists counted on their listeners and readers bringing a Mediterranean scenario to their texts, so that they might rearrange the details of this scenario in the minds of the listener-reader and present a distinctive image of Jesus as catalyst, Jesus as fire starter. For the author known as Matthew, followers of Jesus who have lost their catalytic ability for the fire, that is, those who have neglected, forgotten, or abandoned the gospel, they're no longer good for anything except to be stepped on by other people. Well, from that perspective, persecution and insult directed to neutralized or ineffective followers of Jesus should not be understood as persecution for Jesus' sake, the kind talked about in the Beatitudes. Now, what about the fathers of the church, Eastern, Western, Syriac? When they comment on Matthew chapter 5 verse 13, similar to Robert Barron and James Martin and NT Wright, they also interpret salt and saltiness to be about seasoning and preserving. And the patristics were Mediterranean after all. So what gives? Well, it is true that ancient peoples used salt to preserve food. But you have to ask, did Galilean peasants use salt that way? And it's also true that ancients used salt to season food, like garum. They liked salty foods. But did Galilean peasants, with scarce drinkable water and agonizing dental disease, we've never uncovered a skull from 1st century Palestine with a complete set of teeth, did such people season their food with salt? Very, very sparingly. What was salt primarily to Galilean peasants like Jesus and the vast majority of his audience? It was a catalyst. What modern Western commentators, and also the fathers of the church, miss is that when the Matthean Jesus exhorted his disciples that they should be salt, what makes best sense to Jesus' Galilean peasant setting is when the phrase is earth oven rather than earth. So the Matthean Jesus urges, you, his followers in general, should be salt for the earth oven. Please keep in mind that the patristic commentators on the Gospels, even though they are Mediterranean, lived in a different setting than Jesus. They were not peasants. They were literate urban elites belonging to maybe 0.5% of the total population. They knew and enjoyed salty foods like garum, and they associated salt with seasoning and preserving foods. But these associations wouldn't work for Jesus and his fellow Galilean peasants. As John Pilch and others explain, Galilean peasants did not use salt to preserve their food, and with rampant mouth pain due to terrible dental hygiene, plus scarcity of drinkable substances like water, peasants did not commonly use salt to season their food either. So, following elite patristic sources explaining the Matthean Jesus as exhorting his followers to preserve the culture or to season the good news is a distortion.